filter into the meeting. So a few minutes and then we'll get started. Right, as I was saying, we'll just wait maybe one more minute just for a few more people to come in, and then we'll get started. Great. So there'll be a few more people filtering in, but let's get started. So welcome to this online support group meeting for the FTD, the frontotemporal dementia support group. My name is Professor Jonathan Rohrer. I'm the clinical lead for this group, but you will have interacted with the rest of our team, who you'll meet over the course of the morning. Nikki, Livy, and we've got also Emma with us in person today, and then you'll hear from a couple of other members of the team who have some recorded talks. So welcome to those that have been here many times before. Welcome to those of you that are new to this group. For those that are new to this group, we've been running an FTD support group within the UK and beyond for many years. Originally the Pixies support group, and then in the last 10 or 20 years, the FTD support group. More recently, this has come under the umbrella of Rare Dementia Support, or the RDS. And over time, the services we provide have grown, and we are still growing further. And many of you will have taken part in these meetings, but if you do want some personal advice about specific questions, then you're very welcome to talk to our team, and our team will be very happy to talk to you. There are also some more focused, smaller groups, and well, you'll hear today from our psychology team about the kind of psychological support that we can provide through RDS. Now, one of the things that you will have seen is that over the years, our meetings have been in various places. Well, we are very happy to announce that we've now raised a number of £1 million in order to build our own rare dementia support RDS centre. This is going to be within the University College London, UCL campus. It's going to be a very short distance walk from the National Hospital in Queen's Square. This is going to be a dementia-friendly centre, which will be open for people to come to. It will be a space for meetings, but it will also be a space for people to be able to come to after an appointment, or to come and have a coffee just after one of our meetings. The hope is that it will be open by spring 2025. So we'll still have meetings in other places for a little while and some more online meetings. But a really exciting development, and something we've really been building up to for many years, to have our own, and really the first ever dedicated rare dementia support centre really in the world. So more about that over time. Few things to say. Important for if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box, and not in the chat box. We'll look at those and I'll go through questions in the Q&A session at the end. But without further ado, we will get on with the program. So you're going to hear first from Sam Stern, who's our clinical psychologist that works in our team, who's going to talk about management strategies for certain kinds of behaviour. After that, you'll hear from Emma Harding, who works in our psychology support team about developing an online intervention. Then you'll hear a little bit more about the work that we're going to be doing to really develop more psychological support through Emilie Brotherhood, and then we'll end with some Q&A. So first to Sam, and you'll hear from her for the next 10 or 15 minutes.
Hello, my name's Dr. Sam Stern, and I'm a neuropsychologist at UCLH, working very closely with rare dementia support. I'm very excited to be talking to you today about compulsive behavior and management strategies, in particular to FTD. I will put my contact details up at the end of the presentation, and you're welcome to contact me if you have any questions. Thank you for your attention. So, what are compulsive behaviors? So we think about these things very broadly as repetitive behaviors that can range from very simple, basic, repetitive movements all the way to more complex or compulsive and even ritualistic acts that might involve a series of behaviors or movements performed in sequence. And we often think about these as being driven by obsessional thinking and anxiety. And the idea is that people engage in these compulsive behaviors in an effort to actually decrease something that they're concerned about or feeling anxious about in order to relieve that anxiety or discomfort. As I'll talk about in a moment, this is also often tied to impulsivity and disinhibition, and this might be particularly relevant for individuals with FTD. And just to provide a few examples of what we're talking about when we're thinking about compulsive behaviors, these can be things that are repetitive movements like pacing, tapping, picking. It can also involve compulsive or repetitive touching, hoarding or collecting objects, eating the same food repeatedly, checking behaviors like checking the lock on a door, or checking a phone or a laptop, or checking the stove, cleaning or washing, compulsions to kind of clean our hands or wash other parts of our body, and also repeated verbalizations or saying the same verbalization over and over again. So how do we think about these things in relation to FTD? Well, as I mentioned, compulsive behaviors are kind of a big umbrella category, and we see them present in a range of different conditions. Often when people talk about these, they're really thinking and imagining them most commonly associated with obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. So that might be where you've come across these the most in the past. However, we recognize that some types of compulsive behaviors are very common among persons with FTD, and symptoms can be related oftentimes to things like disinhibition or impulsivity, which are also very common symptoms of FTD. So the kind of inability to have that filter or inhibit a response and acting a bit more impulsively. And thinking about these things and how they might overlap or be related has led to the question of whether compulsive behaviors that we see in FTD are similar to the kinds of compulsive behaviors we might see in other conditions, such as OCD, that we're often talking about in terms of compulsive behaviors. So this has been something that's been looked at. And what we see is that there are some notable differences in investigations that have looked at some of these things. So for one, when we look at individuals with FTD, particularly behavioral variant FTD, compared to OCD, we said that some of these repetitive or compulsive behaviors in FTD are often not associated with things like anxiety, or at least self-reported anxiety, or obsessive types of thoughts. And this is very common with OCD, where often these compulsive behaviors are actually being driven by internal distress or anxiety or obsessions. Also interesting is that when FTD, oftentimes individuals don't necessarily report a sense of relief after completing the behavior. And that's actually a hallmark of OCD, is that when that behavior is actually, or that compulsion rather, is performed, that there's actually a relief of distress. And that's something that kind of motivates that behavior going forward. We don't necessarily see that often in FTD with these kinds of compulsions. Similarly, in FTD, oftentimes these types of compulsive behaviors are actually triggered by something in the environment, something in the immediate surround. And that's actually not common in OCD or these other kinds of compulsive disorders. In these kinds of disorders, oftentimes it's coming, like I said, internally from an anxiety or kind of obsessional thought pattern. And very interesting is that in FTD, oftentimes, if the environmental trigger is actually removed, that behavior can actually be kind of prevented or managed without a lot of elevated distress. That's actually very different than in OCD, where we see that individuals often report really high levels of distress and anxiety if they do not engage in that compulsion. Last, one thing that's been very notable in terms of a difference in FTD is that often these compulsions that people experience are very strongly related to other symptoms of impulsivity and disinhibition. We do see impulsivity and disinhibition associated with other types of compulsive behavior in things like OCD. However, it seems to be much more notable and go along with those symptoms in FTD. So why is this important? Well, for one, studies have really shown that even though we're talking overall about compulsive types of behavior, they actually do present very differently in individuals with FTD versus other conditions that might have compulsive behaviors. And if we understand them as maybe being different in how they present and driven by different factors, then also how we need to address them might be fundamentally different. And in fact, there are a lot of really unique challenges in managing compulsive behaviors in persons with FTD compared to other types of conditions. So for one, symptoms of FTD often can pose barriers to the person being able to actually effectively manage these compulsions and these behaviors. So as we know, FTD often has a lot of other symptoms that are associated with it, such as cognitive changes or changes in maybe insight and that self-reflection in terms of behavior. Impulsivity, as I mentioned, and disinhibition. These are all things that might make it more challenging for the person to actually monitor their behavior and be able to implement strategies to manage these compulsions or not act on them. Similarly, these behaviors or compulsions can often be really distressing and frustrating. And when I say that, I mean not just for the individual with FTD, but also for family members and carers who are interacting with them. And this is compounded by the fact that oftentimes these behaviors can't really change with these usual types of strategies that we might use. And by that, I mean, when somebody's displaying these kinds of compulsive behaviors, and particularly that person with FTD, if they had been displaying these behaviors in the past before their illness, the way that you might handle them could be very different. You might try to reason with them or help kind of alleviate that distress by explaining and exploring it, but that might not be very helpful. So for example, if somebody has a compulsion to check the door, for example, and check the lock and make sure that the lock is locked on the door, before maybe you would say things like, oh, it's okay, remember the door is locked, or remember, look, you can see and you can check it there and you can notice that it's locked, and oh, you just checked it a moment ago. But that might not be helpful for somebody with FTD to manage that behavior. And in fact, those kinds of rationalizing and challenging that could even provoke that behavior to happen more. So how do we manage this? First, I want to highlight that I've broken this down into kind of 4 steps. And I do think that this can be a useful framework in thinking about these things. That being said, I also want to really caveat this with, I think that this also makes this seem like it's very simple. And managing these things, as I mentioned, is actually really challenging and can be very, very frustrating. And it's a process between all individuals of kind of trial and error. So I'll go through each of these steps in detail. And then if we have some time, I'll even run through a bit of an example. But I think the important thing to note is that even though we can think about these steps and break them down, is that this is a process that still can be very challenging, and it's about trying different things and figuring out what works uniquely for the situation and for the individuals involved. Okay, so step one. Step one, I've kind of broken down as first identifying the behavior as a likely symptom of FTD. This is so important. And what I mean by this is really conceptualizing and seeing what the person is doing as really being another symptom of their illness, just like any other symptom they might be experiencing. This actually can be quite challenging because oftentimes these behaviors are hard to identify. They can seem very personal or even volitional. And as I mentioned before, they can be really frustrating and they might not really respond to strategies that we would normally use. It does not just go for family members and carers. Professionals also find these kinds of behavioral symptoms to be the most challenging to manage. And in fact, oftentimes people report that they're harder to manage than things like memory changes. However, by us approaching what is happening in terms of the behavior and really thinking about it as a symptom rather than as something the person is choosing, it really allows us to change how we approach managing it. And this is very important because it can be really difficult to do this. And so we have to kind of first take a step back, see what's happening, and identify, is this something that's related to FTD? And if so, then I need to go down this path of maybe these strategies. So if we've identified it as this is something I think that is a symptom of this, and that's why the person's doing this, the second step is to pick your battles. So to do this, I really propose kind of asking a couple questions. So one, is this behavior merely harmless or a nuisance? And by that I mean, is this something that is bothersome, is not ideal, but is harmless? Or does this behavior put the person and or those around them at risk? And depending on the answer to this question, that might really change how you approach this. So if the behavior is relatively harmless, then you may or may not decide that it really warrants a response. And the reason I propose this is because oftentimes people experience that when they try to address managing the behavior, even using strategies with the best intentions and the utmost skill, it can lead to frustration and distress from both parties. And at the end of the day, it can sometimes not be that helpful, I'll be honest. So what's happening sometimes is that people are trying to solve the problem, but actually it's just making everybody more frustrated. And in the end, it's not really helping that much. And so in these situations where the answer to this is that this behavior might not be preferable, it might be difficult, it might be a nuisance, but it's not really putting anybody at risk and it's relatively harmless, it might actually be more helpful to work on managing your own frustration, coping with the symptoms, and really just trying to see it as part of the illness and kind of more or less trying to just let it go and let it happen. So for example, if the person has a behavior where they need to wash their hands every time they enter the house, and that's, happening multiple times a day, but they're not getting any rashes, they're not overwashing their hands, it's just something that's coming up every single time they come in and out of the house. Is this something to really challenge when it's relatively harmless? Maybe it's not leading to difficulty, and it's not overly intrusive. Now, on the flip side, maybe it does pose a risk. Maybe they're washing their hands lots and lots throughout the day, and they're doing this not just when they enter the house, but maybe they're doing this repeatedly for hours and hours and hours on end, and they're starting to have skin breakdown or there's other issues happening. Then maybe that behavior poses a risk and actually really warrants a response. If it does pose a risk, then unfortunately a response is likely unavoidable. And that would take you more to maybe step 3, match the strategy to the situation. I've broken this down into a few more steps. There's lots of steps in this presentation. But I think the idea of this is to think about first, what is the context of the behavior, and to really investigate this as a detective. So thinking, when and where does the behavior happen? Is there any pattern to this behavior? Does it seem to happen at the same time of day, or is it happening in response to certain cares that are happening? Are there things that are triggering the behavior? Could this be related to unmet needs? Could it be related to something in the environment? Is there possibly something new that they're reacting to? Has there been any recent change in their medical status, like a new medication, or is there a new carer that they've been interacting with? Any kind of change that could provoke this. Then step 2 is really thinking, how might the person be feeling when they behave this way? Do they seem scared? Are they distressed? Is something going on emotionally with them that I could potentially intervene on? And then the third step of this is really to let's intervene on those elements. So once we've done what we call a functional analysis of what's going on in the situation, in the environment, what might be going on with the person, Now we need to do things to intervene. So for intervening with step 1 or the environment, what can we change that will make this behavior less likely to happen? So for example, if this behavior always seems to happen when X is present, try removing X. So for example, if my partner always eats candy when it's around, let's try not having the candy visible in the house or having it easily accessible. Maybe that will help with that compulsion to eat candy. If the behavior might be in response to some unmet need, can we try to address those needs? So for example, maybe there's a hand washing behavior that's happening because the person feels less clean. Maybe that has to do with how they're going about something in their care. And maybe they can't communicate that to us, but maybe if we observe the pattern, we might start to understand that and could try something different to maybe address that. In terms of attending to maybe what the person is feeling in that emotional sense that I mentioned in kind of step 2 of this step, it's really empathizing with those distress feelings and then using anything that might be helpful for that person to help relieve that distress. So if you know as their carer, their family member, of things that they find particularly comforting, maybe that can be helpful to help relieve that distress, things they enjoy doing, things they find calming, that could be helpful. Because even if we know that the compulsion isn't necessarily coming specifically from a feeling of anxiety, it still can be driven and promoted by those feelings of stress. And stress does tend to make these things more likely to continue to happen. So it's important to manage that. Also, it's important because it's a really unpleasant part of the experience for the individual. So once we've done those things, we want to then employ strategies to stay calm and patient while we're doing that. We don't want to try to challenge or engage the person in a discussion about why it's happening, since that's not usually helpful. We want to redirect to maybe possible alternative behaviors that are safer or healthier. So is there something that they enjoy that they could refocus their thoughts on, or could kind of distract them from those moments of distress? And if they can get through that, maybe that will drive that compulsion down a bit. And of course, if safety is an issue, being clear and setting boundaries if needed. If the compulsion is to, for example, drink alcohol and forgetting how much alcohol they're drinking, and it's very unsafe, really thinking about how can I set clear boundaries and protect the individual in their best interests. This is something I think that's also really helpful to discuss with healthcare providers, because obviously you want to take that balance. You want to act in the person's best interest, but also you don't want to be overly punitive. And so working with healthcare providers to raise any ideas of risk is very important. So it can be a collaborative process about how to support the individual, while also setting appropriate boundaries to manage difficult behaviors that could be potentially harmful for the individual or those around them. And 4, we want to consider ways to decrease the likelihood of the behavior occurring in the future. So this is a trial and error process, as I mentioned. So keeping a record of how things are going can be really helpful, because sometimes it's hard to detect those patterns in our minds, but actually if we see it laid out, it can be really helpful. And giving yourself some time to kind of try different things. Be consistent in implementing strategies. So if there are multiple people involved in the person's care, being consistent across those individuals, having a routine established to try, changing the environment to minimize triggers and anticipate those needs. And of course, very importantly, taking care of yourself in that process, as the behaviors can be very frustrating, and trying to be kind to yourself as you do this. Talking to other people about what's worked, because it can be, as I mentioned, a lot of time of trial and error. So kind of helping yourself get the support you can while you're going through that process, and thinking of creative solutions, which is why I think it's really great to have a group of support from other individuals who might be experiencing similar things, so that you can brainstorm or hear what's worked for other people. It might not be exactly what works in your situation with your loved one, but it could be something that I think is very helpful to stimulate ideas, or even to have a jumping off point. Okay, so in the last minute, I just want to very quickly kind of run through maybe an idea for how this could look in an example. So say you have a partner with FTD who has started to compulsively go into their laptop to check their email, to the extent that every time the laptop is present, they're checking their email and then they're checking it again. And so it's become quite disruptive for them doing other things that they enjoy doing. So first, we see this as this is likely related to their FTD. And we might use things to help us, such as thinking about what they were like in the past. Is this a change in their behavior? Is this something that I've seen before? Picking the battle. Maybe this is something that is not actually very obtrusive. Maybe it's something that if you're just around the house, it's something they like to do. It might bother you, or it might be difficult sometimes to interact, but maybe it's something that doesn't have to really be challenged. That's one option. However, if you're starting to notice this is really getting in the way of things like people visiting and having time together, maybe it's something that needs to be intervened on sometimes, and that might be an in-between option. If this is the case, maybe you start to notice that when the laptop is present, the person's much more likely to engage in checking it. But if the laptop is actually in another room or in a designated location and it's not in sight, that actually that behavior doesn't happen as frequently. So maybe something to try is seeing if you and the person could come up with an agreement of maybe during visiting times with family, or during meal times, or even just having a certain amount of time during the day, to actually having the laptop aside and having that not be what we're doing right now. Or having a designated place where they feel that it's okay to have the laptop that isn't in the room where they are often. And so it's about maybe managing that and having some kinds of slight boundaries around that. Noticing, I guess, is there something that the person's anxious about? Maybe the person's really anxious about missing emails, or really worried about what if I'm not coming across clearly in my emails or communicating, or maybe there's something they're waiting on. And so is there anything to do to help with that? Maybe if it's anxiety, finding ways of relieving anxiety and stress. Maybe the person enjoys going for a walk or doing things like that that take their mind off some of that. So maybe that's something to try. And ultimately, I think trialing, if that works, if the laptop's in the other room, for example, what happens? Does the person go and get it? Does that become more distressing? That we have to think around. And really trying these different kinds of strategies and looking at it as it's not a one size fits all. And we can try maybe one thing, see how it works. And if it doesn't end up working, then we can try something else. So I know that was a really quick whistle-stop tour through all of these. But I hope that it's been helpful to think about maybe a different framework of approaching some of these compulsive behaviors that we often see in FTD. If you have any questions or reflections that you'd like to share with me, please do not hesitate to email me. My email is on the screen, and I really appreciate all of your attention. Thank you.
Great. So thank you to Sam for recording that talk for us. Please do contact her or contact us if you have any questions or thoughts about that. So we're going to move on, and I introduce you Emma Harding, who works in our psychology group, a part of RDS, and she's going to talk to you about a new online intervention that is going to be starting very soon. Emma.
Thanks, John. Let's just try and share my screen. Lovely. Hopefully you can all see the right thing, and someone will let me know if not. So lovely to be here today. My name is Emma Harding, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow and Counsellor and Psychotherapist based at the Dementia Research Centre at UCL, and also at the Cognitive Disorders Clinic in Queen's Square. And today, as John mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about an online intervention we are developing and testing to support people living at risk of FTD. And the intervention is called IWARF, which stands for Improving Wellbeing in At-Risk FTD. So that's people who have a confirmed genetic mutation within their family which causes FTD. And I realise that won't be applicable to everyone watching, but I'm hoping that some of what I'm talking about in terms of the experience of living with or supporting someone with FTD and the sorts of psychological approaches and techniques that can be helpful, hopefully some of that will be of relevance to you all more generally. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk through a bit about why we need an intervention like this, how we went about making it, what it is that we've made, and also what we're going to do next now that we've got this intervention. So before I go on, I just want to mention our funders. So the testing of this intervention sits within a 5-year programme grant funded by the National Institute for Health Research, and that's led by Professor Josh Stott in the UCL Division of Psychology and Language Sciences. And Professor Rohrer, who you all know, is a co-investigator on this grant. And the aim of the grant overall is to develop and evaluate psychosocial support for people affected by non-memory-led and inherited dementias like FTD and FFTD. And you'll hear a bit later from my colleague, Dr. Emilie Brotherhood, about some of the other preliminary work that's feeding into this wider overarching project. And I also want to mention that the initial development phase of the iWolf intervention was generously funded by the National Brain Appeals FTD Research Studentships in memory of David Bletchner. So why do we need an intervention like this? Well, we know from existing research, from our clinical experience, and indeed from talking to many of you at support group meetings and annual seminars, that people living at risk of FTD face a number of unique challenges and difficulties. And the research evidence base for this is limited, but when we look at what is out there, we know that people who are at risk of FTD are more likely to experience higher rates of depression and other mood problems, emotional challenges around decisions to talk to family members about the genetic risk, things like a sense of sadness, grief, or fear, perhaps, when they're thinking about the implications of FFTD on children. And given these very specific challenges, there's also a widely acknowledged real lack of appropriate psychological support for people in this group. As I said, there's huge gaps in our knowledge here, and Caroline Greaves, who developed the iWolf intervention and who many of you will know, did some really brilliant work to try and contribute to this evidence base, and hopefully the papers coming out of her PhD work will shed some more and much needed light on the very specifics of that FFTD experience. We also know that many people who are at risk of FTD would also be caring for someone with FTD symptoms. And again, we know from research that that can also have its own specific challenges too. So for example, it can be very isolating for people caring for someone with FTD when the advice and support they might receive from more general dementia support services doesn't quite fit their experience or meet their needs appropriately. It can also be really difficult to manage challenging symptoms like apathy and communication changes, and some of the others we just heard about from Sam. And it can also be really challenging to adjust to and accept some of the changes in roles and responsibilities and relationships that can come with FTD. But as I said, there remain huge gaps in terms of what we actually know about the specifics of the FFTD experience. We do also have some insight into this from our clinical work. So as Sam mentioned, we lead a psychological intervention clinic attached to the Cognitive Disorders Clinic at UCLH. And within that, we work with individuals and families affected by or living at risk of an inherited form of dementia like FFTD. And in that setting, some of the common challenges we see for people living at risk are things like persistent rumination, often about whether they are experiencing symptoms or when these may start. There can be lots of uncertainty about various things like the future, whether to undergo predictive testing, decision-making about having children. There can be concern about the impact on children, perhaps caring responsibilities they may face in the future and how to talk to them about FFTD. There can be this sense sometimes of anxiety about history repeating itself. So people might have a narrative or a story, for example, of what their parents' experience was like, and it might be really hard not to relive that and imagine the same for themselves. And that might be the case even if support and care and awareness have all changed quite a lot since then. We talk to people sometimes about this sense of managing multiple identities or wearing multiple hats. So this sense of how to balance those different roles and how to shift modes between perhaps living at risk themselves and also being a carer at the same time. And people describe some really complex feelings of grief. For example, that might be for a particular person, or it might be for an imagined future. Guilt is another thing that comes up a lot and in a lot of complicated ways. So this might be something we call survivor guilt. If someone has tested negative for a gene, perhaps while their siblings or other family members have tested positive. It might be anticipatory guilt or concerns about the caring responsibilities that other family members may have for them in the future. People can also describe a feeling of being stuck, or a sense that life is kind of on hold, or that FTD is kind of all-encompassing and that it's hard to really think about life and plan outside of that. And finally, people can talk about this sense of injustice. For example, why is this happening to me? Why has this happened to our family? And there are lots of feelings that can bring up alongside it. So feelings of anger around that are quite common. And I should say there's lots more as well, so that some of what I've shared may resonate with elements of your own experience, but it also may not. It's definitely not an exhaustive list of all the ways people feel in this situation. So we'd be really keen to hear, perhaps in the discussion later, but also certainly in the research project as it moves forward, about anything that has chimed for you or hasn't, and if there's anything in particular you'd like to share from your own perspective. So appreciating that people in this situation have a very unique experience and often specific psychological needs, we set about developing an intervention that could offer support. And we designed this as a digital intervention because we wanted to maximise accessibility. So people don't need to be able to get to our centre in London to try it out, but also so that it can fit into people's existing days and lives. So if they have half an hour or 15 minutes spare, they can log in and do a bit, but they don't need to set aside hours for travelling time to and from London for, say, weekly appointments at a set time. So how did we make the intervention? So as I mentioned, the development of iWolf was led by Caroline Greaves, who you can see on the screen here, and I'm sure most of you will know. And it was while Caroline was working in the Gentry team at UCL that she completed her PhD to develop this intervention. And as I mentioned earlier, this work was generously funded by the National Brain Appeals FTD Research Studentships in memory of David Blechner. And Caroline's work was supervised by Professor Jonathan Rohrer and clinical psychologist Professor Josh Stott, who you can also see here on the screen. And to create this intervention, Caroline incorporated the research that we've just been talking about. She also consulted with people with clinical experience of working with people at risk. She drew on her knowledge of the FTD experience that she's gained in conversations with those of you at support group meetings, but also around research visits. And she also did a series of in-depth interviews with people living at risk to understand more about what that lived experience was really like. Some of you tuned in today may have taken part in those, and we hugely appreciate that if so. Caroline then put all of that information together with what we know from the research on different psychological theories about the sorts of interventions and techniques that are proven to help people deal with some of these sorts of difficulties. So things like worries that won't go away, or getting caught up in fears about the future, and perhaps feeling like you're missing out on living life in the present. And then Caroline worked with a software developer to put all of this together and to create the iWolf intervention as it is at the moment. In terms of what it is, so this is a bit of a tricky ask for me to talk about because we will soon be hoping to test this intervention with many of you who would be happy to take part. So I need to try and tell you enough about it to get you interested, but also not give so much away that it kind of spoils it for you if you do eventually give it a go. But in terms of the format, it's what we call a blended intervention. So this is a mix of materials that are accessed online, and those are interspersed with some one-to-one online sessions with a facilitator. And the intervention is self-paced, which means people can move through it at a pace that suits them. So some people might like to do a module a week. It might work best for others to work through blocks of modules all in one go. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to us when we designed it that it could fit into people's lives. So we knew that would need to be quite flexible, as we know many people are working and have multiple family care commitments and other responsibilities that would need to be worked around. So yeah, that flexibility was really key. And we imagine for most people, the whole intervention will last about 6 to 8 weeks. So that's including going through the online stuff, but also having these one-to-one check-ins as well. And the online materials are mostly short videos, so they're between 3 and 6 minutes. And some of these are more informational or educational, so they might include information about FTD, information about symptoms and processes and pathways for things like genetic testing and reproductive decision making. And other videos are more what we'd call therapeutic, so aiming to introduce people to some exercises or techniques or activities that would help support them with managing any difficult thoughts and feelings they might be having related to living at risk. And these might involve things like guided visualizations or breathing exercises, as well as exercises that involve reflecting on personal experiences. And throughout these modules, people would also have these 3 one-hour check-in sessions with a facilitator. And the aims of those are generally to find out how people are getting on with the intervention, any problems that they're having with using it, to really consolidate anything that they have found helpful so far and think about how they might implement that within their daily life, kind of beyond the intervention. It's an opportunity to explore a bit further anything that has really chimed, that people have really liked, that they might like to look into a bit more. And it's also an opportunity to revisit anything that they perhaps haven't got or have some questions about. So while I can't be too specific about the content of the modules, I can tell you a little bit more about the psychological theory and style of therapy that kind of underpins the intervention that it mostly draws on. And this is a form of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT for short. And the clue is really in the name, in that ACT is very acceptance-based. So it's different to something like CBT or cognitive behavioural therapy that many of you may have heard of or given a go. And that is very focused on changing kind of difficult thoughts, feelings and behaviours. And we thought an ACT approach would be more helpful and relevant potentially in FTD, because often there will be thoughts and feelings that are coming up that actually feel very appropriate and very accurate and very rational, and like they're things that it would be very difficult to change. So we really wanted an approach that could fit with that aspect of the experience and still help people and hopefully improve their well-being. So one of the key skills you learn as part of ACT is getting in touch with the present moment, the here and now. So if you're a worrier like me, or perhaps particularly if you're someone navigating life in a family affected by FTD, you might spend a lot of time caught up in thoughts about either the past or the future, perhaps worrying about the things that have happened or things that might happen. But of course, we aren't in the past or the future. We are here right now. And often spending a lot of time caught up in the past or the future doesn't necessarily help us to deal with them any better, and can actually make us feel worse, and also mean that we're kind of missing out on living the best life that we could live in the here and now. So ACT is all about helping us to recognise that and to get back to the present moment. And mindfulness is one of the skills it teaches us to help us do that. And as well as connecting to the present moment with mindfulness, in ACT, we also learn how to observe our thoughts and feelings with a bit of distance. So one way to think about this is almost like if you're in the middle of a big kind of emotional upset, or what we can think of as an emotional storm, it's almost like visualising yourself as the weather reporter reporting on that storm, not someone stuck in the middle of it. And having this bit of distance can help you kind of notice those different feelings rather than being completely overwhelmed by them. And even when we've noticed these difficult thoughts and feelings, another key element of ACT is that we learn to accept them. And this is never a very popular idea at the outset, but just to be clear, that doesn't mean that we really like them, that we welcome them, that we're happy about them. What accepting them means in this context is that we don't spend lots of time and energy fighting them or trying to get rid of them or trying to make them go away. because that takes a lot of resources, and often, you may know if you've ever tried not to think about something, it can often just make those things come back louder and stronger. So again, ACT can teach us lots of practical tips and techniques for how we can actually learn to let those things be there without engaging in too much of a struggle with them. And then the final element of ACT is committed action. And this is all about acting in line with your values. So even when our thoughts and feelings are difficult or upsetting, it helps us to keep moving towards the things that matter to us. And a critical part of this, so ACT also helps us to figure out what it is that really matters to us, and what kind of principles we do want to live in line with. And that those could be things like making a contribution to the community, or being a good friend, or having fun with grandchildren. It might be being creative. It might be being physically very fit. And the idea is, once we've worked out what matters to us, ACT can then help us to find ways to keep moving towards those things, even when there are difficult thoughts chattering away in our mind, or difficult feelings coming up for us. So now that we have this intervention, what are we doing next with it? So we're just about to start our first bit of testing, which is very exciting. And we're starting with a small feasibility study. And this means we're going to try the intervention out with a very small group of people to really see if it's feasible. And to do this, we'll look at things like, do people engage with it? Do they stick with it if they do engage with it? Is it acceptable to them? Which bits of it are most or least engaging or helpful? Does everything work in the intervention, or are there any kind of technical issues that we need to iron out? And once we know if it's feasible, and we make any changes that this small study might suggest would be helpful, we'll then be ready to test the intervention in a randomized controlled trial. This means we'll measure things like people's mood, feeling about their risk, quality of life, levels of acceptance, and then we'll give half of people access to the intervention. And once they've finished that, we'll again measure everyone's mood and other outcomes again, so that we can see if the intervention had the impact we hoped it would for the people who did access it. The half of the group who didn't have access initially will then be offered it. So it's important to say that everyone who takes part will get to experience the intervention. It will just be a matter of timing in terms of who has access when and in what order. So if you might be interested in taking part, we will definitely be in touch, we hope early next year, to let you know how to express your interest. So please do keep an eye on your inboxes. And we also hope to be in touch, of course, once the trial has finished, to let you know how we got on, and also how we hopefully plan to share the intervention more widely, so that everyone who is eligible and who it could be helpful for can access it. In the meantime, I will just say thank you so much for listening. And my contact details are here. If you have any questions at this stage, please do get in touch, or perhaps put them in the Q&A box below. And as always, if you need any extra support, do reach out to the RDS Direct Support team, who are here to support and can also signpost to our service and other sources of support and resources if needed. And thanks very much again to Professor Rohrer and RDS for having me along today.
Great, Emma, thank you so much. That was a really clear talk about the plans for this, and it'd be really exciting to get going with things. So let's move on, and you're going to hear a little bit wider about the work that's going on in this project that Emma mentioned is being led by our psychology group. And this is a recording from Dr. Emilie Brotherhood about that work.
Thanks everyone for having me here today. For some of you, I'm becoming a familiar face in seminars and webinars, as I've spoken to you about this research before. But this is the last chance to take part in this piece of research, and so I will be running through this one final time as a reminder, and also for anybody here in the audience today who may be coming to the webinar for the first time. So my name is Emilie Brotherhood. I'm a research psychologist at the Dementia Research Centre, UCL, and I'm speaking to you all this morning as part of the research team doing research into designing better online support for FTD, and crucially to ask for your help. So In this research project, we are designing new online support programs, one for people with FTD and one for family and friends of people with FTD. And the idea is that we're designing these support programs to be delivered exclusively online. And this is so that they can reach more people and so that you can access the information within the support program day or night, whenever convenient for you. But we understand that when we're making support programs that are accessed online only, these can have its challenges. The more technical issues, the less likely it is that they will get used. So we want to minimize these challenges and learn from success stories that you've had and what's also worked well for you before when you've been finding out information about your health or a loved one's health online. The more of you that we hear from, the more we can learn from different perspectives of the lived experience of FTD, which means that we can use this information to tweak how we make these support programs, truly putting your and your loved one's needs at the very heart of the design. So how you can help us is by kindly completing our digital access survey. And there are 3 different surveys which are aimed at different audiences, and this is depending on your lived experience of FTD. So the first is as a person living with the diagnosis of FTD, second for any family member or friend of a person with FTD, and thirdly for anyone listening in our audience today who's a healthcare professional who has experience of supporting people with FTD. The survey takes approximately 10 to 15 minutes to complete, and we will ask you questions such as your internet use and preferences in accessing health information, your attitudes generally towards web-based resources, so video conferencing platforms like Zoom, questions about your health and well-being, and then also about your views of security and privacy when looking at things online. I'm delighted to say that we've heard from 297 people so far with an experience of rare dementias such as FTD. And this is 77% of our target, but we would like to see responses from a further 90 people by Christmas. And so if you haven't already taken part, we would really appreciate you taking the time to fill this out. The links will be available in the follow-up email that will come round to you after the webinar has taken place. All that's left for me to say is a huge thanks to those of you listening this morning who are considering taking part between now and Christmas, and also a huge thanks, of course, to those of you who've already taken the time to complete the survey. We're looking forward to looking through your responses as a group and letting you know our findings when hopefully we can present at a webinar at a later date.
Great. So thank you very much to Emilie. Please do help out. I think we know that it's likely that we'll need to provide this kind of support in multiple formats for different people. And it's really important that we know the different ways that people are going to use it. Some people will really enjoy doing it online, but some people will want to do other things face-to-face and in different places. So I'm going to invite everyone back, and Emma and Nikki back to the group, and we'll go through any questions. Please do put any questions that you have in the Q&A. So Emma, just to start with, what's the best way for people who would like to be in the at-risk feasibility study to take part? What's the best way of people contacting you or expressing their interest in that?
Yes, thank you. So we do have a dedicated study email address, which is looked after by a few of us involved in the trial and in John's wider team. So if you want to send any emails to iwolf@ucl.ac.uk, we'll be very happy to hear from you, and we can have a chat as a team. And I think we could probably put that email in the follow-up resources for people. So yeah, don't worry if you haven't jotted that down. So
it's iWolf, IWARF @ucl.ac.uk.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. And the question was whether iWolf would be available to people. It says residents of the USA, but really we mean people outside of the UK.
Yes, so we are just long term. ideally, we would want this to be available and accessible to everyone that it's relevant for. We are actually just going through our kind of ethics protocols and approvals to think about kind of international partners and how that will work. And I know RDS is also looking at their kind of international reach and policies as well at the moment. So it's slightly to be determined, but I have made a note of your interest, so perhaps I can follow up with you in particular one-to-one once we know a bit more about how that will work in the next phase.
Great. The question was about reminding people what IWARF stands for.
Yes, good test. So it's improving well-being in at-risk FTD. Yeah.
So I think, and the point being, having been the person that made the name up, is that, as Emma very nicely put, this is really about thinking about living at risk in general, and one doesn't need to necessarily have a sense of depression or anxiety, but it's really about well-being and improving well-being in people living at risk. So it's about the whole nature of living at risk of a genetic dementia, and specifically here genetic forms of FTD. So that's why there's a focus on well-being and improving that. And we know that, as Emma said, really from the work, that there can be a kind of chronic sense of decreased well-being rather than necessarily a diagnosable mental health condition like depression or anxiety. So I think that's important that we focus on that as well.
Great. And if sorry, John, I was just going to
no.
I was just going to add to that exactly that often people will say, well, no, I'm not depressed and I'm not anxious. This just is something that I'm living with, and that factors into my thinking and my planning, and that does have an impact. So yeah, absolutely, it's about living as well as possible in what can be a challenging situation.
Yeah, great. So I saw that somebody had asked a little bit about somebody whose wife has FTD and was in a care home, and I wonder whether, Nikki, you might just talk a little bit about the work your team have done in the past about working with care homes that don't necessarily know anything about FTD.
Yeah, of course. We're doing a lot of work with care homes at the moment. We get approached regularly by care homes themselves when they've got new residents coming in to help with the transition. And we are going into care homes either online or actually going and visiting to speak to the care home staff. And it's quite interesting, actually, because whereas some of them will say to us, but we don't have anybody in here with FTD, or we don't have many people in here with FTD. When they start hearing about the symptoms of FTD, they suddenly realise that they have a lot more people in there than they anticipated, but it's just very underdiagnosed within the care homes. So we have our staff that can do those visits, and we've got some really good videos as well. John, you appear very nicely on one of them to explain FTD well. But what's really fundamental with what we're doing is we're taking people that are living with a diagnosis or a carer looking after somebody who's living with FTD, or even a bereaved carer, into the care homes to share their experience. And quite often when we have bereaved carers that go into the care homes, they've often had a loved one in a care home but previously, and they can really sort of speak to them about what went well and what actually went wrong and what could have been better. So it really helps guide sort of the care going forward. So along with sort of lots of resources that we take with them, actually having that living experience is really fundamental to shaping sort of the ongoing care within a care home.
Great. I don't think, oh, here we are. We do have another question. My partner was diagnosed 2 years ago, age 57, with both BVFTD and PPA. and has deteriorated rapidly. We now have appointments every 9 months with a hospital in Oxford. Should we expect to have any MRI at any point, even for research purposes? It hasn't been mentioned. Well, that's probably on me to answer that. MRI and brain imaging in general has been used really in FTD for diagnosis. And we would not traditionally do further MRI imaging unless the diagnosis wasn't clear on a clinical basis. And the reason for that is that it doesn't tell us anything different to just a clinical and cognitive assessment with someone that we would do in clinic. And it doesn't change the way that we would treat people. It often becomes rather distressing over time to go into a scanner as well. So we don't traditionally, and nobody really does do repeat imaging unless there's a question over the diagnosis. The question is whether that's helpful on a research basis. Well, one can only do that as part of a research study, dedicated research study that someone has consented to go into. We do some work on that here, as do other groups, but that hasn't translated yet really into NHS practice or practice clinically around the world in terms of how that might be helpful. It doesn't really inform us about the speed of change. It doesn't inform us very much about any other form of management over and above just the standard clinical and cognitive assessment with people. So we wouldn't expect to necessarily repeat brain imaging again. Okay, let's have a look down. So Emma, maybe for you, good question. This is sort of an entire PhD. What are the lessons learned from other genetic diseases and the programs they have to supporting those living at risk? I know there'll be big differences, but some of the feelings of grief, life on hold, anxiety is going to be consistent across that.
Definitely, thank you. Yes, good question. And I try not to talk for as long as the PhDs were. But I think it's definitely striking the balance between what do we know is happening in other diseases that might apply and not reinventing the wheel, but also really acknowledging what is specific to the FTD experience. So I think quite often, and John, you might want to elaborate or kind of, add to what I'm saying here, but I think often, say, Huntington's protocols can be used in an FFTD context as kind of a nearest proxy, but there are important differences there. So I think we're really trying to figure out what those differences are, while we still lean on things like, say, acceptance and commitment therapy is not specific to this condition. It's used in lots of kind of chronic pain scenarios and lots of different settings. But that's something we know works really well for some of the elements of the FFTD experience, but we also want to balance that with what is specific. So it's kind of borrowing what we can where we can, but keeping quite attuned to the specifics, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we have learned a lot from Huntington's disease, is the most relevant neurological illness. But I think we've learned a lot, and I know as we've developed these things, we've learned a lot from cancer and living at risk of cancer and other diseases, I think, outside of the neurology and brain spectrum. Undoubtedly, I think that I like the phrase that I learned from Caroline's PhD, which is the sense of biographical disruption. So something that disrupts your, we all have a story of our lives and how it's going. And sometimes there's some large event that disrupts that normal biography of your life. And for some people, for instance, that might be a cancer diagnosis. But in this instance, of course, it is finding out that you're at risk of a genetic form of a neurodegenerative illness. And I think, but there are lots that we've learned from dealing with that biographical disruption and how you think about that from lots of other diseases, I think. Question is, within our research, do we consider the issues with other medical issues such as type 1 diabetes? In our case, symptoms dismissed as diabetic, not neurological. I think that if you see any neurologist, then of course we always, one of the difficult jobs of being a physician is distinguishing what an illness is. And sometimes we talk in this group as if the diagnosis is easy, but of course diagnosis is not easy, as many of you will attest to. Many of you will have gone through many years of investigation without the right diagnosis made, and it can be difficult to know the right emphasis to put on certain things. I think one of the things, maybe the thing you're alluding to here, is around changes in appetite and the development of a sweet tooth. That's something that we've tried to highlight through the work of this group. It's an unusual symptom, but rather specific for frontotemporal dementia. And it is not necessarily a symptom recognized by primary care doctors, GPs, or even by other hospital doctors. And so I think that can be quite difficult, and we're on an ever-ending road of education of people, and that's a huge strand of the work that we do through RDS, is really to try and educate other health professionals around the nature of what FTD is. And many of you will know this, but there's lots of work to show that getting a diagnosis of FTD takes much longer from the onset of symptoms than Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia. It's probably the longest time between symptom onset and diagnosis in terms of the time that people get a diagnosis. And many of you, I know, have experienced that. Donna asks about the iWarf email in the chat. Please, Emma, thank you for answering that. How different is a PET scan to diagnose FTD compared to what a CAT scan might show? So CAT scan is what we might call a CT scan. We don't use CT scans very much. Nowadays, we tend to use MRI scans, but both CT scans or MRI scans, they show the structure of the brain. They show if brain cells have been lost. A PET scan, and usually what we mean here is a type of PET scan called an FDG, or a glucose PET scan. That shows that there has been a change in the glucose metabolism, so the way that the brain uses glucose, and that decreases. That means there's less activity in the brain cells. So a PET scan shows activity in the brain cells, whereas a CT or an MRI scan shows loss of those brain cells. Theoretically, the activity goes down before the cells are lost. And so sometimes early on in FTD, where a CT or MRI scan might have been reported as not showing any change, a PET scan might be shown to have some change and therefore be used in the diagnosis. It's a little bit dependent. Different clinics will use different types of scans depending on their expertise and their local expertise. In essence, you get very similar information from each of those types of scans, and really very little, by the time diagnosis is often made, very little difference between them, but there are some subtle, but it really, in some ways, it depends more on the quality of the people reading the scans, the X-ray doctors or radiologists, and their local expertise. Do we have any insights into how FTD might link to MND? My husband has BVFTD, diagnosed 3 years ago, but is investigated for this at the moment due to mobility. Well, the majority of people with FTD will not have motor neurone disease, but a substantial minority will do, probably about 10 to 15%. So 85% of people won't ever develop motor neurone disease, but about 10 to 15% of people will also develop motor neurone disease. One can start with either of those symptoms. So people who have motor neurone disease can go on to develop FTD, and people with FTD can go on to develop motor neurone disease. The association is really with the behavioral variants, not so much with the language variants. And they do share what's happening in the brain, the kind of protein, abnormal protein we find in the brain sometimes, and also sometimes the same genetics. So particularly the gene known as C9orf72, C9orf72, that's a genetic problem that can cause both FTD and also MND, motor neurone disease. And sometimes that can cause those illnesses differently in different members of the family. So one member may have motor neurone disease and the other may have frontotemporal dementia. So they are related conditions, and certainly there are a set of people who have FTD that will develop motor neurone disease, but it is the minority of people, and the majority of people will not develop that. Right. First time attending one of these webinars. Will the IWolf intervention be open to those where a genetic risk has not yet been confirmed, or only when the risk is confirmed? My mum has been diagnosed with FTD. Her father had MND. Concerned about links, she not had genetic testing. So, the answer to that at present is no. But I think maybe your story is probably worth us even discussing on a one-to-one basis. Very happy to chat. We often will meet, and myself and my team will often meet with people like yourself, just to talk through what options you have in terms of testing and thinking about the best way forward here. So perhaps you're anonymous here, but if you will email Livy or Nikki, and they'll put you in touch with me, and maybe we can then chat offline about the best way forward, and for us to help. And we often will help families like yours think about the best way forward. A good question is the decrease in the use of glucose in the brain. What's driving the increased sweet tooth? It isn't. Here we're just using glucose as all cell. That's how, of course, all cells in the body require glucose. That's why we need it. This is just a marker of that there's less brain cell activity here. So it's not what drives it. It's very complex. What drives the sweet tooth? Some of it is related to our appetite and eating hormones, which are in a bit of the brain called hypothalamus, but that connects up to our frontal lobe. So a bit is complex. No one knows quite the right answer to that. We seem hardwired to recognize and observe milestones, and these take on an additional layer of significance for those living at risk. I wonder if IWolf could incorporate or recognize the additional stress that living at risk has when we reach or celebrate milestones, e.g. birthdays. I think that's a good idea. It's not currently incorporated in that, but maybe, of course, it would be, Emma, maybe through the individual check-ins with people.
Yes, exactly. And I think, yeah, that's a really, really good point. And I think links to what you were mentioning, John, earlier about this biographical disruption, that we're kind of encouraged to see our lives in terms of these big milestone points. And if we think about what ACT is trying to do, which is like to bring us into the moment, it's very anti that. If we kind of live from these milestone to milestones, we lose all those moments in between, which are where we actually are. So I think that's really critical. And I agree, yes, I think that would be something that would hopefully come out in the check-ins, because we'll be exploring when do you need these particular techniques, or when do you find that you're kind of getting caught up in thinking about those milestones, so we can figure out when when those particular grounding and getting present techniques are helpful for people. But it's also just that kind of feedback that you've just offered in the chat there that we're hoping the feasibility study will flag as well. So really great to have some of that just kind of on the fly now. And I've made a note and we'll add it to our, but I hope it'll be a long list of things that could improve it. So thank you for sharing that.
And I think the experience that we've had over the years is that those milestones are variable. I mean, I think it can be one's own birthday. It can be the birthday of an affected family member. It can be a significant event that family member had, the time at which they found they had a genetic diagnosis. There are a number of milestones which are individually significant. I think is important. So one of the questions is, if the person with FTD has negative genetic testing, are children still at increased risk? And if so, by how much? So we know 99% of the genetic causes of FTD. It may be that we don't know 100, but we know almost everything, 99%. So if genetic testing is negative and there isn't a strong family history, then the risk is essentially zero to children. Remember, just to be clear, that probably 2/3, so somewhere between 2/3 and 70% of people with FTD do not have genetic illness, zero risk to their children, above the risk of having FTD in general, which is low. It's only the third of people that have a form of FTD or its associated illnesses that goes from generation to generation, or who we find a genetic cause in who have that risk. So essentially the majority, although it's obviously about 2/3 to a third of people do not have a genetic illness. And that's really important to note. Does the onset of FTD follow the same timeline as the parents? Starter symptoms rate of decline? The answer to that is no. There is a large poster that sits behind me in my office, which is, we did a very large study of this worldwide, where we collected data from every FTD center worldwide and looked at this question. We look at the kind of statistics of this. So we can give a number between 0 and 1 of the likelihood of this following the same association with the age at which parents develop symptoms. So if it was 0, if that number is 0, there would be absolutely no association at all. So anyone could develop it at any time. If the number is 1, it means you would get it at exactly the same time as your parent got it. So for those that know some maths and statistics, that's a correlation. So 1 perfect correlation means you would definitely get it at the same time as your parent. 0 would be absolutely no correlation. So any time. It's different for the different genetic causes. So for people with progranulin or C9orf72, which are 2 most common causes of genetic FTD, that value is around 0.2 or 0.3, which means it's very low. And people in the family can develop frontotemporal dementia often 5, 10, 15, sometimes even 20 years different to parents or other members of the family. For tau, MAPT, it's a little bit higher. It's between about 0.5 and 0.6. So there's a little bit more of a correlation, but it's still not nearing 1. So there often is some difference, often 5 years, sometimes between 5 and 10 years, difference between the age at which people can develop symptoms in the family. And similarly, the rate of decline, meaning that the length of the illness can also be very different between members of the family. We've done a lot of work trying to predict that. We're not very good at predicting the age at which people develop symptoms at the moment, unfortunately. And then Donna has written, my story is similar, brother with FTD, dad with MND, other family members MND. Again, if you would like to talk about your family history, very happy to chat. In that situation, we would undoubtedly, if you came to our clinic, we would undoubtedly recommend genetic testing. But happy to meet and chat. And we run a monthly, it's essentially a monthly research clinic to meet with families who would like to chat about their family history. So please do contact the team, the RDS team, and we can always make contact. And then the last question here, is there any relationship between stroke and dementia, specifically FTD? Well, there is, of course, a relationship between stroke and dementia in general. Really, the two most common causes of dementia are, of course, Alzheimer's disease and what we call vascular dementia or vascular cognitive impairment. Vascular cognitive impairment is due to either two things. One, it's due to either a slow thinning of our small blood vessels, that's often not noticeable, or by recurrent blockage of large vessels. Blockage of a large vessel is what a stroke is, and when one of our large blood vessels gets blocked. So people who've had a stroke or recurrent strokes can develop vascular cognitive impairment or what would have been called vascular dementia. As one gets older, there is, of course, increased risk. Stroke is an age-related disease like Alzheimer's disease. And so people, the older one gets, often when we scan people, we do find evidence that people have some vascular disease. And that in itself can cause cognitive problems. However, there is no known relationship specifically with FTD. If people do have vascular disease, that is a separate problem. It's an extremely common problem, extremely common when people get into their 70s, particularly 80s and 90s, but it is not specifically related to FTD. Okay, I think that is all the questions that we have been through. So in the last couple of minutes, I'll remember that we just to say that the work of the RDS is really thanks to the National Brain Appeal MBA charity, and it's them really that have helped us raise the money towards our new centre and have supported us over many years. So I'd like to finish by thanking everybody, particularly Sam, Emma and Emilie for their talks today, to Nikki and Livy and her team for organising things, and to all of you that have attended and contributed. Please do contact us and don't wait between meetings to contact us. We have lots of things that can be helpful along the way, and if you want to talk to people individually, then that's no problem. We can always arrange that. So we'll finish with the NBA video, just telling you a little bit about the work of what the National Brain Appeal is doing. All right, thank you all. See you at the next meeting.
Hello, my name is Eva Tate and I'm the Major Appeals Manager for the National Brain Appeal. The National Brain Appeal is the charity that raises much needed funds for the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery and the UCL Queen Square Institute of Neurology, altogether known as Queen Square in London. It is our aim as a charity to improve the lives of people living with neurological conditions across the UK. And at the moment, that is amounting to around 1 in 6 of us, including rare dementias. We have been funding rare dementia support since the beginning, and certainly since it was formalised in 2016. Over the past few years, we've been aiming to raise up to £350,000 a year to be able to improve and accelerate the services available to people. And in line with that expansion, and you'll know that there's now more than 5,000 members of RDS across the UK and some worldwide. We have committed as a charity to raise up to £7 million to create the world's first rare dementia support centre. This will be a permanent home for RDS and will be created around 3 key pillars, which are support, education and research for professionals, healthcare professionals, and also research into what type of support is most helpful to people living with these conditions, their families and friends. We have found a site for the centre and are well on our way to creating this fundraising goal. We've raised well over £1 million and have had some very high profile support over the past couple of years. Most notably in the last 6 months, Richard Walker, the group chairman of Iceland Foods, has climbed Everest for us, a truly remarkable feat. And 30,000 colleagues at Iceland Foods have been raising money for the Rare Dementia Support Centre over June during their fundraising weeks. So thank you very much to them. But we've also had lots and lots of supporters who have done incredible races, runs, walks. We've had people travel across the Mongolian steppe raising funds for us, across the Pyrenees, and also people doing bake sales and all sorts of community events as well. We'd like to thank each and every one of you, all the people who have taken part in fundraising and who continue to take part in fundraising. There is some match funding available for anybody who would like to raise funds for the centre, and I would encourage you to get in touch with a member of my team, with myself or any member of the National Brain Appeal team who can help to support you and encourage you in any of your efforts. We also had a garden at Chelsea Flower Show this year where the designer Charlie Hawkes worked with members of RDS, particularly those living with posterior cortical atrophy, to create an incredibly beautiful garden that went on to win 3 medals, one of which was a gold at Chelsea. So we're absolutely delighted by the awareness raising that this brought about and all the coverage on BBC. The garden has now moved to Exbury Gardens in Hampshire, and it's free to visit by anybody who's a member of RDS and their carer. We hope that it being in Hampshire will allow more people to be able to visit than were able to visit Chelsea. And ultimately, we hope that that garden will be able to move to the Rare Dementia Support Centre when it's ready to be able to accept it. Thank you again, and I encourage you please just to contact us if and to follow us also on social media. That you'll hear a lot more news about what's happening at RDS in terms of fundraising, and you'll also be able to keep up to date with any of our activities that we are planning over the next couple of years. Thank you again, and we really are looking forward to making sure that this centre is a real home from home for those living with these conditions, their families and friends. Thank you again.
My name is Stephanie Still, and I'm the Senior Fundraising Officer at the National Brain Appeal. I'd like to start off by saying thank you to anyone who's fundraised for us in the past. You are fantastic and your efforts are really valued. I have a wonderful job at the National Brain Appeal because I get to look after all of the fundraisers who want to take on an activity to support us. Over the years, we've seen people take on incredible challenges like marathons, taken on triathlons. We've even had a few who braved a skydive. We've also had wonderful fundraisers who've brought together friends, family and colleagues to host a coffee morning or to arrange a golf day or carol concert, you name it, to support RDS. Our fundraisers enable RDS to keep running and mean we can continue to support people like you. So if you're interested in becoming a fundraiser or you'd like to fundraise again, I will be here every step of the way to support you. If you might be interested in taking on an active challenge like a run, swim or walk, there are a range of suggestions on our website of upcoming events that you could take part in. Or if you're like me and aren't really into sporting activities, then there's still a range of things that you can do to support us, from bake sales to coffee mornings, and I'll be here to make suggestions and to help you think up ideas. I really hope to hear from some of you, and we'll be here to help you make a successful, fun fundraiser. Thank you.